Hello. Welcome to our discussion about the early government of the United States. I'm going to do this in a series of videos just so you guys can get the general information without having to read a textbook, which you all seem to love so much. So, how did the American government work after and actually during the Revolutionary War is kind of our question for today. And we have this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which is the first national government of the United States. It was actually created shortly after the Declaration of Independence to kind of say, all right, we got rid of a king. Well, now what do we do? And so the government was very worried about having too strong of a government. We just got rid of a tyrannical king. So let's try to have not so much government. And so we have these different states, Pennsylvania, New York, Georgia, North Carolina, kind of enter into a league of friendship, is what they called it. In political terms, we would call it a confederation, which is where there's a group of states, or whatever, working together for a common purpose. The key aspect of this, though, was all the states kind of worked together, but overall there was no strong central government. And what I mean by that is, like today, we have in Washington, D.C., a president who is supposed to enforce the laws. We have a Congress who makes the laws. We have a strong court system. The Articles of Confederation government really didn't have that. And so that becomes an issue that we'll see going on. And in fact, the states really have more power than the government. However, for all of its weaknesses, there are a couple good things that come from this. One, there's the government that ends the Revolutionary War. So that's a plus. They also have this thing called the Northwest Ordinance that I want you to be aware of. What this Northwest Ordinance is, after the Treaty of Paris, England says, okay, you win, now you get all this land. Specifically the land east of the Mississippi River. Well, how do we organize it? How do we make sure it doesn't all become Virginia? So what they do, they basically make a giant grid system here. And the only reason I bring this up, I think it's really kind of interesting. Like, if you look at the map of Pennsylvania there on the bottom right, you see all of our counties are kind of squiggly and follow rivers and stuff like that. But if you go to a lot more western states, I have Indiana there as an example, you see more of a grid pattern in how the states are broken up, to the fact that we have states that look like rectangles. Thanks, Wyoming. But this Northwest Ordinance actually was a success. But there are a lot of other problems. I was supposed to get rid of that slide, but I didn't. Life goes on. When we talk about the Articles government, we have to talk about strengths and its weaknesses. So definitely take a moment here, pause it. I'll talk about these. But make sure you note, I would say 3 or 4 on each side here. So in your notes, probably make a T column like that. 4 strengths, 4 weaknesses. You should be good to go. So looking at strengths, this government could declare war. It could make an army and a navy. It could make peace. It could sign treaties. It could borrow money. And these are all important things if you're fighting a war, which this government was doing at the time. And also, let us not forget the ultimate important power of organizing a post office. Actually, back in the day, that would be really important. But that is a fun tidbit to put in there. However, we can look at this chart and notice there's a lot more weaknesses. Yes, they could make an army and a navy, but they couldn't draft soldiers. The government had to ask the different states, hey, can we borrow some people to fight a war for us? Not really an effective solution if you're being invaded. Any treaties that the country made, they couldn't enforce, which basically meant the states could go out and do whatever they wanted. Similarly, the government could not collect taxes. And this becomes a huge, huge issue because you need taxes to pay for stuff, like soldiers. Instead, they had to ask the states to let them give them money, and the states typically said, no. There's no chief executive, so there was no president in charge making sure laws actually happened. Again, we kind of take that for granted today. Similarly, there was no national court system. No one to really say, okay, you did something wrong here. And if problems happened between states, no one could make them compromise. Couldn't control interstate commerce, which means that no one was regulating what was going between like New York and Pennsylvania trade-wise. Another key thing is it was very difficult to pass laws. 2/3 of the states needed to agree. So there was 13 original states, 9 of them needed to agree for a law to actually happen. In today's system, more or less, you need at least half of Congresspeople to agree to it. We'll talk about how that's a little bit different later, but the 2/3 instead of 1/2 majority made it a lot harder. Not to mention, people started seeing right away that this government was really weak and things need to be changed. However, for change to happen, all of the states needed to agree to amend the Articles of Confederation. It's going to be a huge, huge problem. But another problem that we see is Shays' Rebellion. And this is a thing that you need to be aware of. Both what causes it, but also what's the long-term effect. So after the Revolutionary War, all the different states borrowed a lot of money. As we've discussed before, war is expensive. And so all of these states and the national government go into debt. And so to pay for that debt, Massachusetts decides to raise its taxes. These taxes, however, were hardest on the farmers, because they weren't making a whole lot of money to begin with. And then you raise their taxes on them, and they're finding it impossible to pay for these taxes. And then the other problem is, if they don't pay these taxes, the government can come in and take their farms. So this angers two groups of people. Obviously the farmers. And the farmers, we put them on the opposite side of, like, the city folk, the urban people, because they're actually benefiting from this system. So these two groups of people are going to be really kind of angry. Rural versus urban Americans there. Ultimately, what ends up happening, we have 1,200 farmers marching down to their courthouses, closing them down, but if the city basically raises enough soldiers to kind of block them, the farmer scatters, rebellion's dissolved, no major violence happens. However, there's the fear that more violence could occur. And so what happens with Shays' Rebellion, and here's the kicker here, is we see that since the government is not strong enough to enforce its laws, there's going to be some problems. So overall, why do we see these Articles of Confederation fail? One, this wasn't like one country. It was almost 13 mini countries who didn't want to work together. And so that becomes a problem. And then we see an uprising like Shays' Rebellion that proves that we need to strengthen the government. And so from there, we strengthen the government. Thank you for listening. Yeah, we'll chat later. Cheers.